today.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome. It's a beautiful day, and it makes me feel energized already. So, I would like to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited guest and a very grateful resident on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, Lekwungen speaking, including the Esquimalt, the Songhees, and many others. I pledge to work to reduce the harms brought to the First Nations people by my ancestors. I invite you, if you wish, to either put your own acknowledgement in the chat or say it silently in your heart. All media exposure that is sympathetic to Mum Stop the Harm on our goals, our challenges, and our stories can be really valuable and the best way to spread the word to the large audience. When we are called upon to speak, we want to be the best, of course, that we can. No one expects us to be perfect or professional. We have stories. We have stories. But I'm here to say you can do it, but you don't have to do it. And that's really important to us at Mum Stop the Harm, that you not feel compelled when you just aren't ready or just don't have the heart to speak in public. Don't do it. Don't feel the pressure. But today you probably get inspired by Andy to be the best we can on media. And I want to just be very mindful and grateful to the people who have already been on the media and done such a great job. The whole membership thanks you so much. So Andy is and has been manager of so many communications departments at different ministries in the BC government. Um, I met Andy when he was the communications director for the coroner's service. And he has always been sympathetic to our cause. So he has now joined our board of directors, or will be on the board of directors. And he is our total go-to guy for all media questions, as I think he will say to us today. He's been extremely generous and open, and we're so grateful. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks so much for that warm introduction, Leslie. And like you, I'm very, very happy to be in a beautiful sunny environment today. And I am presenting today from the Lekwungen speaking territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And I just first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that and thank everyone for their interest today. The goal for today is to give everyone something, a tool, a tactic, a trick that they can use to help them feel more comfortable if they're doing media interviews, or even just something in terms of how you can approach a local outlet, whether that's your local radio station, your local TV station, whomever it might be. We just want to give you tools and tricks to help you achieve your goals. And Mum Stop the Harm has held a very special place in my heart. I can tell you, in my 3.5 years with the coroner's service here in British Columbia, just the work that everyone has done to help amplify the message, to help share the personal stories. At the coroner's service, we were only able to share data. It was very hard for privacy reasons to share some of the personal stories. And I really do think that is an entryway to people who may not understand this crisis to really understanding it. So I feel very fortunate to be presenting today. And the format for today, we will try and keep it to less of me gabbing at you and more of our opportunity to have a Q&A at the end where your questions will be welcome. I will say that if we don't get to every question in the Q&A, we will be answering them in writing after. So everyone's voice will have an opportunity to get you some information after. Hopefully by the end of the day, I'll be able to provide you with a bit of an overview of the current media landscape and what has changed really over the last 10 years. Just like we're in crisis right now for a toxic drug supply across Canada and across the world, media are in crisis too, and they're facing cutbacks. They're facing, fewer reporters being asked to do more across more mediums. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. A lot of the goals that I have are to provide tools and tactics to help you whether you're doing an interview, contacting local media, maybe it's sharing the information in your networks. We'll talk about those pieces today. For those that are doing interviews, we'll talk about how different mediums require different strategies. We'll talk about how to prepare for those interviews, whether they're in print, TV, radio, virtual. And we'll also talk a little bit about how to fight stigma and how to exercise your right of reply, how to write letters to the editor, and what to do if you notice a mistake has been made. And like I said at the end, I'm happy to take questions, point you to some resources that'll be shared, and talk about sort of next steps. As Leslie said, I used to work for the Coroner's Service of British Columbia. I'm now working as a manager of government and media relations with WorkSafe BC. I've worked as a reporter. I've worked in strategic communications. Really, I do feel, it's very important that I'm in a position right now where I feel very lucky that I can share this information with you today. So, in the QA in particular, I hope that I can add some expertise, both from a journalistic standpoint from my former experience there, but in the current environment where I deal with media on a daily basis. As I said off the top, and those of you that have done interviews and those of you that consume media will know this too, the game has changed. The game has changed dramatically in terms of how media do their job. And whether you're in an urban center or a rural environment in our country, it doesn't matter where you live. It's the same situation across Canada. We are in a 24/7 environment of media production. And when I started as a reporter in Ottawa in the early 2000s, I can tell you that the game changed so dramatically in a 5-year period that reporters now, if they're not first, they're hearing about it from their editors, they're hearing about it from their bosses. And so they're always chasing a new angle, looking for a new source, looking for a new voice. We used to enjoy an era where media were trusted, where reporters' stories were fact-checked, they were read by several editors, there was a 3-source rule, so we knew there was balance in the story. The stories were being thoroughly copy edited, proofread, made sure that there was balance. There were beat writers that understood the subject matter area. Those were the good old days of journalism. And it laments me to say that we are in a new era with fewer reporters as a consequence of media convergence. We see all these different media organizations combining. What that means is that we see fewer outlets. We see a more centralized approach to journalism. So there's less original content. And unfortunately, because of that, we see less localized coverage. And so the goal today is to talk a little bit about how we can make sure we're influencing both locally and so that we're influencing our ability to tell those stories across all of our communities so that we can really get the message out. And I will share a PDF of this PowerPoint for anyone that wants it. So if you're feverishly taking notes right now, know that I will be sharing this as a PDF for those that would like to see it after. Unfortunately, we're also seeing a mutiny of journalists. And what I mean by that is that people that have always wanted to work in the profession, a lot of them are now leaving the profession, moving into freelance roles or leaving the industry altogether because of the lack of job security. So for those few journalists that we have that are working right now, we need to make sure that we're understanding the demands I think that they're under. And that's one of the key takeaways I'd like to leave everyone with today is that the media that are there today are under an immense amount of pressure. And I think knowing that and understanding that going into whether we're pitching stories directly or responding to interview requests or just being consumers of news and sharing that information, the more of a relationship we can develop, I think the better our organization will be. But I think just for our communities too, that is such an important reflection to have. The quality of journalism has obviously deteriorated because when you have fewer reporters chasing more stories across more mediums, it just, the context isn't there. And what that means for us is that we're going to have fewer reporters that really get what it is we're talking about. We're lucky to have nationally reporters like Andrea Wu who really understand the context in which we're in, whether that's, understanding the toxicity of the drug supply, understanding where governments are and what positions they've had, understanding some of the rhetoric we hear from governments. Having a reporter that gets that really helps. but that's rare that we're dealing with people that know the content well. And so effectively, we have to become our own media. We have to find ways for us to get the narrative out to reporters and to be early in the stories and to help shape the message. We're also dealing right now with a highly digital environment where we have more and more people consuming less and less content and consuming it in smaller segments. So before, it wouldn't be uncommon for people to gather and watch the 6 o'clock news together, where stories were 90 seconds to 2 minutes, and people were consuming that. We're lucky now for those under the age of 40, and I've got a lot of people in my network that are in this environment that consume news regularly through a traditional newscast. We are in a user choice era where people select the content they want to read, and if it's something that they don't want to hear or they don't want to read or it doesn't interest them, if they don't get involved in it early, they're going to continue to form little segments of what they follow. And that's based on algorithms and different ways that pages like Facebook and Twitter, they try and customize the content so that if you Google something, your Facebook feed and your Twitter feed is likely going to have similar content to that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that forms bias, but it's really challenging now for different organizations, whether it's Mum Stop the Harm or governments or agencies trying to get their message out. It makes things more and more challenging. But I think by understanding that it's a user choice era, we can be more creative in our approach in terms of getting that message out. But bottom line, I think it's important too to reflect that the public trust in journalism is eroding. And we've seen that probably most characteristically with what we saw in the US election and the years that we had Donald Trump as the US president and what happened with media in that last year. That is now coming across the border, and we're seeing that in Canada. The trust is gone, so we have to be creative. Of course, in the midst of a global pandemic, those impacts were felt nationally here as well. We saw 67 media outlets closed temporarily or permanently in Canada. And, as a consumer of news and as somebody that was once a journalist, I can't tell you how many people I have in my network that I hear from on a weekly basis that are looking for work, that are really looking for different ways to get back into the industry. And so one of the things that we'll have to be wary of, I think, is how to pitch stories to freelance journalists, because we know the traditional newsroom isn't there. And so we have to be creative with the resources we have. And this has really been felt primarily in communities where mid-sized cities or large townships that used to have local news, used to have a local TV report, used to have a local radio station that would have a beat reporter covering different things. We're not seeing that anymore. Everything is centralized through urban centers and even then regionally and nationally. So we see more and more of the same content appearing in papers across Canada as opposed to the localized version of the story. So what does that mean for us? Well, now when a reporter calls, given the limited resources we have, it's crucial that we're prepared for media when they call. And so one of the things that we can do to prepare for that, and I think the Mum Stop the Harm webpage does a really good job, it's really clear what the organization stands for. So there is a resource already for journalists looking for information. But then when a reporter calls, it's really trying to determine if we're the right source for them, who the right person is to speak to it, and if it is a local angle we should speak to, making sure that we're preparing for that reporter so that we're able to deliver the best message. I can tell you that I learned a lot in my first probably 200, 300 interviews as a spokesperson. The biggest takeaway I had from doing that was making sure that we could anticipate what kind of questions would be coming at us. And the more you prepare, the better product you're going to be able to give to that reporter. And I think too, recognizing that reporters aren't out there 90% of the time for gotcha journalism. They're looking to tell a story. And with our organization, we really are, we're a voice of the narrative. We're there to tell the human interest side of a story and to really put faces to this crisis. My hearts go out to each of you who have lost somebody from this crisis. And I can tell you the stories that resonated with me the most were the stories I heard from Mum Stop the Harm and people who were directly impacted. I think for us to get through the data and to get through the politicized nature of how this crisis has been treated in the media, been treated by government, it's sharing these stories and it's having the courage to share these stories. So, you know, it'd be remiss not to applaud you all for the work that you've done to date and the work that you're going to be doing. Which is why when a reporter calls, as I set the context earlier, we have fewer and fewer opportunities because of this shrinking media environment to shape the message and to tell the story. So when we do, we're reaching a wider audience now, and that's just the nature of the business now. Know that when a reporter does call and reaches out, they want to hear our story. They've done the work already to recognize the valuable voices that are provided through this organization, and they want to work with you and know that your voice is critical. Speak your truth. You're the expert. Reporters more and more, because we don't have beat reporters that understand the subject and the content, you're going to help them. You're like an educator, an advocate, and a storyteller all in one. And we're not perfect. We're all human beings, but the ways that we tell stories, just having the courage to share your story, that's 95% of the battle. And everything else will fall into place after. Just pause there for a moment. Jenny, are there any themes emerging in the questions that I should be addressing before I go on to the next slide? I think you're on mute. Oh, there we go. Yep.
There we go. Yeah, no, I think we're on track, Andy. That's great.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you. I'll check in again in a couple of slides. You know, generally the work that we're doing for Mom Stop the Harm, we're not going to be in a crisis situation in terms of responding to a breaking news story. So it gives us a little bit more time to do that preparation. And so understanding what media need, I think that is a really important part of, you know, again, another key takeaway from today is if you can come away with understanding the importance of preparation, so writing down the 2 or 3 things you want to say, understanding how important your voice is to the crisis, but also understanding when journalists are contacting Mom Stop the Harm, 95% of the time, they want 2 things. One, that advocacy voice. So what does government need to do? What does society need to do? But 2, to understand the human nature of this and to really understand what society doesn't necessarily know about the toxic drug supply, what society doesn't know about the impact families have felt from loss through this crisis. Because I can tell you, even in my own network, there are people that don't, again, because they can choose what content they receive, we need to get those stories out into the narrative that talk about the human side of the crisis. And again, I applaud those of you that have done interviews to date, because I can tell you that these are the stories that resonate. And the more that we can share and the more that we can talk about things, that we can destigmatize the crisis, that we can make sure that the right language is being used, that the right data is being used, that will be how we bend the curve and how we try and help reverse the stigmatizing language that we see and some of the stigmatizing attitudes we see in our society. And that's happening from coast to coast. No part of our country is immune to that right now. Words matter, images matter. So one of the things that's so important to understand is that if you do have photos to accompany the stories you're telling, whether that's a photo of your son, your daughter, your neighbor, somebody that's been impacted by this crisis, if you're sharing that story, it's so important to understand that media will want visuals to go with that. And again, that helps, I think, to humanize it for the viewer or the reader or the listener, because we know even if you're doing a radio interview, there's probably going to be a web story that goes along with it. So thinking about that beforehand as you're preparing your messaging, what images can you provide to help tell that story and to help, again, create meaning and connection for people that are consuming the story? Again, recognizing that you're an important voice and that you're going to be able to help share that human side of the story. Knowing that reporters are probably reacting to something that's happening in the news, and they probably will have a main source, and that primarily we may be that supporting voice if we're responding to a media request. And so I think it's so important that by telling those stories that we understand that it's our role to get beyond the data and to talk about what's happening. And then to shift into, once we've shared that story, into the advocacy of how we can change the narrative and how we can move forward. And I think too, you know, as you're preparing your key messaging, there's 3 questions I think you need to be able to answer. How are you impacted by this crisis? What could change an outcome? And what is the one thing that you would like to see changed immediately? Because reporters want everything for today, right? So who's impacted, what is needed, and what could change today? And if you keep just those 3 questions in your frame of mind and come back to your key messaging over and over again in your interview, that's going to help you be successful. Because reporters, at the end of the day, they only have so much time too. So you may only get 10 minutes with the reporter, but if you can repeat your key messages 2 or 3 times in that interview, that's going to help set you up for success. Media ultimately want these things in their story. They want to see some level of action, and whether that's advocacy or change or somebody asking for change. They want to see conflict or controversy, and that could include injury, loss of life. That could include 2 different organizations pitting themselves against each other, maybe government saying one thing, but another agency saying another, and they want the emotion. And I think we can deliver all 3 of those things to reporters. And I think, you know, if we've heard interviews before too with people from Mom Stop the Harm in the past, you know, a big piece of what we do is, I think it's destigmatizing the story, but also showing that this is impacting people from all walks of life, that this is impacting people in every community. So that's something you can share. And you can also talk about what we need to see. And I mean, Leslie could probably talk a little bit more about this as we shift into the QA, but you know, big part of that is, how do we create access to safer supply? How do we create a continuum of care in society? And what are the steps that we need to take to try and help bypass, you know, years of talk and little action from governments? And again, that's, I think, where you have a voice. And if you need help preparing for that, there's a group of people on the board that can help you with key messaging to help you prepare for that question of what do we want to see? What do we want to see change? So again, the questions that you should be prepared to answer are, how are you impacted? So the emotional side of the story. What are the steps that governments or agencies need to take to drive that change? And what's that one thing that can happen today to make the biggest difference? And if you come back to those 3 things throughout your interview, I think you're going to be successful. Remember too, reporters are, generally speaking, reporters aren't out there looking for that gotcha style of journalism. The only time they're going to do that is with elected officials. So they want to hear your voice, and our voices here with Mom Stop the Harm are critical to change. Recognizing too that sometimes a reporter is not going to call us, particularly if they're busy. If we know something's coming up in our community, or we know something's going to happen, you know, at the government level, or if there's an anniversary coming up, we can also pitch a reporter directly. But because reporters have fewer and fewer minutes in their day and they're covering more and more stories, I think it's so crucial that we're prepared when we're calling reporters. In one of the PDFs that'll be shared, there's kind of a little guide to how to pitch directly, especially if you're dealing with local or community media. But here's some highlights from that. And the biggest piece is having a pitch prepared and scripted out. What are the 3 things you want to tell that reporter and why they should care about the story? And not all communities are receptive to our voice. And I know that's changing, and everyone's doing a great job of that. And not all outlets are going to want to cover this story. We have to change that. I was chatting with a friend of mine in a rural part of southwestern Ontario last week, and they were telling me about someone that they knew that they played hockey with that had a non-fatal injury from an overdose event, and them trying to tell that story and reaching out to me for some advice. And I can tell you that the challenges that they received from that small town paper not wanting to tell their story, it's just very illustrative that there still are some bad attitudes out there, and we've got to continue to do our work. And again, this is the group that's going to help change that voice. I think too, knowing the deadline of that outlet. So if you're pitching to a community paper, when do they publish? When do they need their content by? If it's a TV station, understanding what their deadlines are. So if it's a 5 o'clock newscast, they're going to need to have that story probably wrapped up by 2:30 so they can move into editing. Or if you're pitching it for the next day, giving them a lot of time and access. If it's radio, knowing who you're pitching and what story, like what host you're pitching or what reporter you're pitching and what times of day they work. Generally speaking, most of this information will be available on those websites for the papers, but if you're not sure, or the radio station or the TV station, if you're not sure, the first time you call, ask them. They'll be so appreciative you did. And again, it comes to that two-way respect and that relationship that we have with reporters. Expect reporters will want the exclusive angle and expect that they'll want visuals to go with it. If you need data, make sure that you have that ready to reference. And once the story is published, do the reporter and the station or the outlet a solid and share that story in your network and thank them for it. The time, the 2 minutes it takes you to say thank you to the reporter goes a long, long way in their book. And I can tell you, very few people do it. So that's a big piece that you can have in terms of forming that relationship for the next story. We talked a bit already about having your key messages prepared, but always restate your key messages. Repeat them, repeat them, repeat them. One of the things I learned early on, and I've probably done about 1,500 interviews now, one of the things I do every time I'm in an interview, it's this third bullet. Regardless of the question you get asked, always try and start your interview with, I'd like to start by saying, and that's your number one key message. It could be, I'd like to start by saying, we're now 5 years into the illicit drug crisis here in British Columbia, and more than 7,000 people have lost their lives. The time for action is now. Repeat that at the very end of your interview, start of your interview, end of your interview. Whatever your key message is for that audience, drive that message home. I can tell you from my time working in journalism, 90% of the time, they're going to take your first statement and your last statement as part of your story, regardless of what medium it is. And it's okay to repeat yourself. We know people's attention spans are like squirrels these days. Like they're going to get distracted by the next thing they hear, the next thing they see. So particularly in a crowded digital environment, repeating and repeating your key message is crucial. I've even done that on this slide very intentionally. I put repeat your key message 3 times because I wanted to ingrain that in my head before I talked about it today. At the end of the interview, know that you're often going to be given an opportunity to say, is there anything you'd like to add? And again, you can come back to your key message, or if you missed saying something that you wanted to talk about, go back to your script, collect your thoughts, make sure that you take the time to answer that question. Even though in a live interview, it's okay to pause and take time and really collect your thoughts. One of the things I always do before an interview, I do a little breathing exercise. I take 5 seconds and nice deep breath, and I try and let out any tension I have. And I think just setting aside a minute before, if you're going to be doing a live interview or a taped interview or a print interview with somebody taking notes, just give yourself that minute to collect your thoughts beforehand. And don't be afraid to use these bridging techniques every time you answer a question, because often you're going to get asked a question you're not going to know the answer to. And it's okay to say that. A lot of the times I'm not an expert on stuff I get asked about in my current job at WorkSafe BC. And a lot of the times it's another agency. And so one of the things I often will say is, I can't tell you that because you need to talk to this agency, but what I can tell you is, and I think, and it's that first sub bullet, that is such a good piece because A, it builds credibility for you. You're not speaking to things you shouldn't be, but B, it gives you a way to shift the narrative into back to your key messages and what our organization stands for. If you do say you're going to get back to them with info, please do. If it's not you, contact somebody in the organization who can provide that info on our behalf. Never answer hypotheticals, don't fake an answer, and always avoid speculation. I know I'm running a little bit behind here, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Know your audience, know your outlet, know the medium you're dealing with. Print journalism, they have more time to think about things and write a story that's going to have some substance. With live radio, you're not being edited, so you can drive your key message through. And even if a reporter asks you a question that is not in your lane, again, you can bridge out of that and talk about the key messaging that you want to deliver. Of course, not ignoring their question completely, but again, use those bridging techniques to get you where you need to go. Taped radio, drive your key message home 2 to 3 times, repeat your key messaging, but understand in a taped interview, they want sound bites. So be able to deliver as you prepare your key messaging script before that interview. If it's a 20-second answer, it's not going to get used. Typically in radio, 4 to 5 seconds. For TV, you're up to 8 seconds. So those clips have to be short and punchy. So find ways to really jam that message into a short soundbite and repeat it several times throughout your interview. And of course, if we ever get the opportunity to be part of a documentary or a feature, that's the one exception where you don't necessarily have to be the expert because they will have researched. So that's the one area where you can really be authentic and tell your story and not have to necessarily worry about educating the reporter. A big tip though, if we don't tell our story, someone else is going to. So we want to shape the story. We want to be the voice. And again, that's why I give you all today, have the courage. Don't be afraid. I know it's scary and I get anxious. I've done more than 1,000 interviews and I can tell you, I get anxious before every interview. But that breathing technique beforehand or whatever you can do to be mindful and get into that frame of mind, it's so important that you're going into those interviews prepared, calm, cool, and collected, and it will yield you great results. Even if you're talking to a reporter you've never talked to before, it's such a good technique. Know if you're pre-recorded and you stumble, it's okay to pause and start again. If you're live and you stumble, it's okay. It's natural. We're all human beings. We're not perfect. And if we were, our society would be a very, very different environment. I think I'll pause there for a second. Jenny, any other questions before I get into the do's and don'ts? And you're on mute, Jenny.
Happens every time. I just see a comment from Kim Porter. If you'd like, a reporter friend called me for my input on an issue. I trusted him and so agreed somewhat. I'm prepared. I asked him to ask specific questions to help pull the information I knew out and to help guide the direction of the interview. Probably not a recommended technique, but it worked because of our mutual trust. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's okay if you're going into an interview, it's okay to say to a reporter, can I get the questions in advance? Again, reporters, if they have time, they're going to spend the time to do that because they want you to be prepared too. They want you to feel comfortable. So Kim, that's a great point, and thank you for sharing that. And I see some other comments too. Yeah, I think having messages prepared about safe supply, decriminalization, lowering stigma, and how we do that, words matter. So as opposed to saying addict, a person who uses drugs, pointing reporters to resources that might already be out there in your community. Again, we are probably the people that know the most about this crisis. Give them the resources that they may be unaware of and drive home that key messaging over and over again. Do's and don'ts. Because you're going to get a copy of this, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. Driving home that message again on preparing, breathing before your interview, know your audience and know the medium you're working with. Again, keep it simple. Your story may only use 1 or 2 quotes, so be prepared to keep your answers brief and jargon free. Repeat your message and bridge when you need to or refer them to a different source. Again, don't speculate as we talked about before. If a reporter asks you a negative question, reframe it into a positive light. Don't repeat negative language. Or instead of saying don't repeat negative language, say repeat positive language. Speak in the positive, speak in the affirmative. Sometimes reporters, particularly if they're looking for a reaction from you, they will leave dead air. You don't have to fill that dead air. It's okay to remain silent and wait for them to ask their next question. As a source, unless you have a history with that reporter and you have a long-standing relationship with them, don't speak off the record. There is no such thing as off the record. And try to avoid saying no comment. There's a famous example from Stephen Duckett, who was the president and CEO with Alberta Health Services. I encourage you all to Google the "I'm eating my cookie" on YouTube. Basically, this is what happens if you try and avoid a question by saying something ridiculous, it's going to go viral. Generally, other tips, and this is where we get into the right of reply and the right to request corrections. I know we're in an environment right now where we still see stigmatizing language used in media. There are sources that still use stigmatizing language, and there are outlets that continue to show stigmatizing imagery. It's an uphill battle, but we will get there. There are reporters that are working on this. There are agencies that are working on this. Behind the scenes, I'm going to be working with Leslie and Petra and Jenny to try and help work with this. Right now, it's because reporters just don't know better in some cases, and they don't have the time, or they don't have access to the images they need to help tell that story. In our communities, we must all be advocates for the destigmatizing language and for imagery that isn't going to stigmatize the crisis further. I know I don't have to get into the technical details on that, but it's okay to call up an outlet, whether it's TV, radio, print, digital. It's okay to call them up and say, do you know what the impact of this word or this image is? I'm somebody that's lost somebody from this crisis, and I can tell you words matter, images matter. If you frame it that way, respectfully to the reporter, and offer suggestions, rather than show somebody on the downtown, like I'm using a BC example here because this is my environment, but how many images do we see of somebody using a needle on the downtown east side, often an Indigenous homeless person? How often is that the image that goes with the crisis? We have to find ways to show positive imagery. Maybe somebody using at a safe consumption site. Maybe people carrying naloxone with them. Maybe it's a discussion with somebody and their doctor talking about safe prescription guidelines. Thinking of ways to try and suggest to the reporter of what they could use as an image doesn't mean you have to give them that image. If you have it, great, awesome. But giving them the ideas and the creativity to do something different when you're calling them, or if it's a word choice, giving them what they should be using, these are all crucial steps to changing the narrative. Remember, media have a societal responsibility and a social responsibility to share information objectively with the community. And yes, there's business-driven interests with every news outlet, but if we recognize that they have a societal responsibility, it's okay for us to call them out when they're not serving us well. And 98% of the time, they want to hear that. They want to know how they can be better, because ultimately that's going to help build trust, and in an era of misinformation, to rebuild credibility. Unfortunately, back to my earlier point too, especially people under the age of 40, we're reading headlines and maybe the lead of a story. And 90% of the time, and I just saw it come up in the chat too, headlines can be damaging. That is a big piece, because a lot of people won't read past the first 50 words of a story and won't read past a headline. If you see a sensational headline, call it out. But again, do it respectfully and tell them about the damage there. To Ben's point, he'd said that there are a few people who are aware that the language is stigmatizing, even in the recovery community, so that we have to be careful in how we approach people. Again, that comes back to that respectful conversation. And I think if we're doing it from a place of care and empathy and wanting to do better, I think that's going to drive us forward. And Jen Mahoney says that whenever she tries to get a story to the local CBC, yes, she can never find the direct email to the show or the website. And there's a generic email. If you ever need help with that, I'll include my email at the end. There are ways around that. The access to that information is so frustrating, and I completely agree with this point. So Jan, I'm more than happy to provide some suggestions and even do up a little sheet of how to get the right contact info, and I'll commit to doing that after this webinar. But there are ways to get it. If you email that generic email address and ask for the show hosts in your community and who the producers are, they will give you the phone numbers and the email addresses for those shows. I'm going to really quickly touch on social media. I think there's one point I want to deliver. Know that you're always representing Mums Stop the Harm, even if you're not intending to. And I think that's such a crucial point, because there's so much credibility with this organization and trust with this organization that when you're on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or this TikTok, I don't understand this TikTok, people dancing and being happy. I love that social media. Anyway, whatever the social media medium is that you're using, know that regardless of whether or not you're intending to represent us or not, you're going to be branded as somebody from Mom Stop the Harm. So always remember, whatever you say, it can be held to you as somebody that's representing the organization. We see it all the time with people that put these disclaimers in their Twitter handles or their Facebook pages that, thoughts are my own. Well, yes, they're your own, but you can always have somebody misinterpret and try and twist your words. So just again, social responsibility as we're posting things, just always keep that in mind and know what you post is permanent, even if you delete it. If somebody wants to see that badly enough, they'll go back and find it. And we just have to look at local elected officials or people in positions of power for examples of that. The other thing I want to share on social media, you have to get your message out 7 times at a minimum for somebody to actually hear it and receive it. We are in a crowded digital environment where people are getting messages jammed at them 24/7. So 7 different ways to reach your intended audience. And it doesn't have to be that same message 7 times, but it's 7 different ways of sharing that information. And media are using social media now as sources, as original sources in their story. So screen captures or direct quotes from tweets, just know that that's being done. We will share a do's and don'ts sheet with you at the end of this by email. Jenny's going to send that out along with a making an impact document, which is just a 2-pager on how to work with local media. It'll capture a lot of the things that we've talked about here today. I'll also PDF a copy of this presentation. I had some color issues with it earlier, so I'm going to remove some of the background images and just make it really easy to read. Know that as we shift now into the QA portion, if there's anything that we don't get to, we will provide a written response. And know that I'm always available for consults or follow-ups, subject to my availability. I'm happy to help. I really do believe in the work that you're doing, and I just applaud all of you. So with that, I'll leave my contact information up there. If you have any questions that you think about later on down the road, know I can be a resource for you. But I'm sorry I went a little bit over time, but I really do want to take time for questions now for those that have them. So Jenny, back over to you to facilitate that.
That's great. Andy, I'm wondering if we could stop the share and then go into gallery.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Does that now come off there? Are we now into gallery?
I'm still seeing your view, but that might be.
We can see your desktop sort of.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not good. Let me see how I fix that. One moment, please. Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just put my apologies for that. The joy of technology, it doesn't matter how many times you present, you're still going to be in a situation where, there we go. We're much better. Doesn't matter how many times you do these, there's still always things that you learn every time you present. So thanks for that patience.
That's great. So does anyone have any questions? They could use the hand reaction and unmute yourself. So Jacqueline.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Gwen Anderson, and I'm just wondering, with this Stop the Harm group, where are you and where are we at right now?
Well, maybe should I answer that?
Yes, yeah, that's great, Leslie.
Hi, Jacqueline. Your question is, who are we and what are we doing and where are we at now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll see if I can do that quickly. Well, Mom Stop, are you a member of Mom Stop the Harm?
Yes, I've just learned about it.
Oh, good. Well, go to our webpage and join, and we're really grateful to have you and welcome. Mom Stop the Harm is essentially 2 things in particular: advocacy for better drug policies and support for families who have either lost someone or who are have a loved one in problematic substance use. So we have the support and advocacy. We stand for compassionate drug policies for people who use drugs, and we try and stop the deaths. So that's who we are, founded by 3 of us, Leslie, and Petra Schultz and Lorna Thomas. What's going on right now is we're fighting hard for a safer supply of pharmaceutical alternatives for people who use drugs so they won't die, or so they won't have catastrophic overdoses. We are working with government, with BC government. At least I can speak for myself. I'm on some committees as a family member and voice. We are speaking on media whenever we can. We are doing an action on the 14th, next Wednesday, in Victoria at the legislature. And that's what we're doing. And where are we at? We're fighting for the same damn things we've been fighting for the last 5 or 6 years. And that is to have compassionate, evidence-based drug policies, evidence-based treatment, wide pathways for people to recover, and support for families who are grieving. So that's where we're at. I hope that answers your question.
Actually, my daughter had 2 best friends and her boyfriend die of a fentanyl overdose. And I reached out to the Community Hospice Society, and because of the COVID-19 and the way that Zoom and they're over, I don't know, but there was no response.
Okay.
And I looked on your site, I tried to be able to get anywhere on it, and I just wasn't able. So I'm not sure what it is. Is it too complicated, and should we be making it more simple for the simple person like myself?
How about this idea? How about you and I talk about this offline?
That would be wonderful.
Okay. Are you on Facebook?
Yes.
Just look me up on Facebook Messenger and send me a message and we'll connect. But thanks for that. And I hope I can answer you all. I think I can.
Can you give me your whole name? Oh, I see it here. It's on the bottom. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Great. Thank you. If I could ask Cindy Dudley if she has a question for you, Andy, and then following Cindy will be Rhonda.
Oh, hi, Andy. Thanks very much for this. It's been great. I just wanted to know, I'm pretty new to the advocacy and stuff, and I'm just wondering, is there kind of a list or something of name, like when we say addict, what we should say instead, kind of what our acceptable words are?
Yeah, Cindy, thanks so much for the question. And as I was thinking, as I was presenting, there's a really good document. It's called Words Matter, and it was I forget, was it the BCCDC, Leslie, that put that together?
Several different organizations have put those together, but they have a good one. Yes.
Yeah, we'll pull a couple together, and I can get those to Jenny maybe as one document to share. But again, I think a lot of reporters wish they knew the power of their words, and even the debate between calling this an overdose crisis or an illicit drug crisis, that debate is happening right now in the narrative. So short answer is yes, there are resources. We'll pull something together for you, and thanks for your kind words.
Great, thank you.
Great. Rhonda?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. That's great.
I came in a little bit late because I happened to be at work, so I caught the last bit with my lunch here, but I'm struggling. I'm also a nurse and I work for Alberta Health Services, and I'm a mom who lost her son. So, and it's brought me from ICU emergency nursing to now I work at a homeless shelter with Indigenous people using substances and so on and so on. So I struggle because I've had several interviews, but I do it from Mom Stop the Harm basis. But is there anything that I should be weary of or careful about because of my job? And my job at the homeless mission is not through Alberta Health Services, it's separate, right? But I still work for Alberta Health Services casual in another job.
Yeah, Rhonda, I think that's probably something that, my advice to you would be to let I'm sure you have a general media line with Alberta Health Services. So I would just flag for them that as a community member and not through your professional role that you do this. I don't think it's ever going to become an issue, but it's good for them to be aware, because by flagging that for them, you've done your piece. And then if they have an issue with it, they can talk to you about it. But I would think that they will have no problem with that. But it's always good just from a corporate standpoint to do that. And I'm sure you probably have you may have even AHS guidelines that'll help, help
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah,
differentiate that.
I've read that a little bit. I haven't contacted the media, and actually my workplace with Alberta Health Services is extremely supportive of what I'm doing. And we have a general email out that I'm always putting stuff about Mom Stop the Harm and what we're doing and so on and so on, and get a lot of people helping in that
Right.
regard. But I just thought I should ask just to make sure I'm not missing something.
The other thing I would say, and thanks for asking, and I'm sure there are other people that can resonate with that, I think it actually also gives you another level of credibility.
Yes.
And I think if you talk about your different voices that you have anytime you do a media interview, that goes a long way. I think the other thing is that maybe the comms people in Alberta Health Services, maybe that will help you to also get more of the Mom Stop the Harm voice out. So great question, and thank you for asking it.
I did actually have an interview last year. Alberta Health Services got a hold of me regarding honoring my child at Christmas time. And I did bring up overdose. I did bring up the crisis. I brought up those things which they did actually put in their piece. And I had mentioned that I have another child who is in active substance use right now. So they have contacted me to leave the door open when he's ready to. So it has helped. It has given definite credibility. I noticed too, when I say I'm a nurse, they dive down a different direction with it. So I'm always trying to bring back the messaging of Mom Stop the Harm. So
yeah, thanks for the question.
Okay.
Thank you. Could we please ask Jo Hayes to share her question?
Yes, thanks very much, Andy, first of all, for this great chat. My question is there an outlet or some sort of fact-checking website for those of us who are who are dealing with? I tend to read medical things and scientific things, and so often I just don't know if the facts are true, and we get articles thrown out there. So, and most recently to do with COVID, there's just so much misinformation, and I know it's misinformation, but I find it so difficult to be able to go to one site or a number of sites and fact check. So could you maybe give us some resources for that?
Yeah, and Leslie, feel free to jump in after my short answer here, but I think where I tend to lean when I get questions about credibility of information is I try and go to agencies that are legislated to speak to those pieces and use them as the starting point, and then advocacy groups as a secondary point. The short answer is that there's so much information out there that how do you create credibility of that information and know it is peer-reviewed, evidence-based? How do we get to that point? And so if you're ever running into a challenge with that, always happy to help. But I think particularly related to the toxic drug supply crisis that we're all facing right now, I tend to go to government sources for data and to peer-reviewed academic journals for additional fodder and for additional intel. Ultimately, there are going to be different voices out there. You mentioned COVID. We've all seen the power of big pharma in creating credibility issues with brands that they're competing against, which is, to me, is just a heartless outcome of what's happening. But we see it with our crisis too. And I think knowing that there's always going to be people putting misinformation out there, we have to do what we can to cite the right experts. So if you ever need any helping hand on that, if you're about to do an interview and you want to know where to source your information, depending on where you're speaking from and what you're speaking to, I'm always happy to help with that. Leslie, anything you'd like to add to that?
I concur. When I'm going to have an interview, I generally go to the government sites. They're unfortunately not as up to date as I would like sometimes, but then I have a few other people that I depend on, and you are now one of them, Andy, to fact check. And if you get something, if you want to give a number and you're not sure exactly what that number is, you can say, from what I understand, I believe it is 7,000 deaths you know, you're in the ballpark. But as Andy said before, if you don't know, just say, I'm just not sure. I'll find out. So.
Yeah, and it's that reframing, right? You know, from what I've read, like Leslie said, that's a great way of bridging, but you should consult with the expert at the end. That also, like, I don't think anyone expects this group to be the data experts. I think we do, back to that ACE acronym, you know, action, conflict, or emotion, like those are the sort of the three things that every reporter looks for in a story. So knowing that we're not the evidence part of that, we're the emotion part primarily, but also the advocacy and action side. So I think, Joe, it's a great question. And the more of a digital world we shift to, the more opportunity there is for people to post their own data. And sometimes it's not accurate. So going to an official legislated source is, I think, the best way around that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Jan Mahoney.
Yes, I was just wondering, when we send out these notices to the media and we get requests for interviews, should we be passing that on to the board or the BC heads? If we've already shared our story, does Mom Stop the Harm have a list of people that want to talk, so our stories aren't the only ones that are getting out there?
Jenny, Jenny, you might want to speak to that, as you just made a list, or are in the process of making a list, let's say.
Yeah, just to share, I think that's one thing I've learned from Andy is to be organized for events and have our advocates who are willing and open to being available to media on a master list. So, you know, I know there's people attending across Canada this morning. So if that's something that you're willing to do and you'd like to be available for media interviews, we have a master list of advocates that I maintain. And for example, in BC next week, it's a busy media week. And so we have a list ready to go for those short calls that come in quickly, wanting to speak to someone. So you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat if that's something you're interested in doing.
Jenny, before we take the next question, I do see two related questions in the chat from Jan and Tracy, or comments. And it's about, you know, if your organization doesn't let employees speak to the media. And I can tell you, I ran into this when I was at the coroner service too, where we had people that wanted to speak about different issues. And, you know, we even have it a little bit at WorkSafe. At the end of the day, if you're speaking on behalf of your organization, you do have to get clearance through your communications department first. But as a private citizen, we are all entitled to the ability to speak. And my advice is that if you want to speak to this issue and you do end up working for an agency, like whether it's a health authority or you're working in a related industry, if you have a chat with your communications department before you do that advocacy work, there's going to be a mutual understanding, and they should be able to give you that framework to be able to speak to the media. I just would suggest, if you're going to do it, have a conversation about it as opposed to an email, because it'll be a lot easier, I think, to create that space for you to tell your story by doing that rather than doing it by email, because you'll get shut down by email. It's a lot harder to say no to somebody by phone. I do know that Fraser Health, for example, as Tracy said, no employee is allowed to speak to the press or be photographed without media relations permission. I think if they understand the story, they are likely to help you and actually might even be an advocate for you. So have a chat with your employer if you're in that situation. If you need any advice on how to frame that conversation, again, happy to help out. But I think those are two very excellent points. So I just wanted to address them.
Great. I did have Ben Gorner on the list, but I don't think he's here, or his hand is down. So we have Jacqueline. E.T. Sorry, I don't know your last name, Jacqueline. Hi there.
Say Jacqueline Thompson. I actually put my questions in the chat. I was wondering about if there's like an email introduction or a signature template that we should be using in our email, and as well if there's like a canned introduction information presentation, like something we could start off with. Primarily because I wanted to build our Indigenous family network here in Treaty 4 territory, Saskatchewan. Thanks.
Okay, should I answer that? Hi, Jackie.
Sure, and I can add to it after, Leslie.
Hi, Jackie. Okay, I was just going to say that yes, we have a brand new, beautiful logo. We always ask, and the website, our website, if you check it out, has a really good encapsulated sort of what our mission mandate is. But I was going to say, oh, if you're speaking under the auspices of Mom Stop the Harm, make sure you're, please stay within our, like I say, our mandate, our vision. You know, we don't say, for instance, we don't say, well, we should, you know, they should arrest all the drug dealers and throw them in jail. We don't say that. That's not us. And there's other things too, but I think everybody who's a member has already been through that information process. Yes, please, Jackie, speak out and on behalf of Indigenous and lowering stigma and lowering the death. It's really good to see you.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, if you're ever looking, like if there's a need for a template, for example, in the 2-page PDF we're going to send out about approaching local media, there is a starting point for a script of how to reach out to them. But if there's ever a script or a template that's needed, we can work on that behind the scenes to try and help with that. I'm not sure, Jenny or Leslie, if there is a PowerPoint, so if somebody's making a presentation, if there's a branded PowerPoint or a starting point or a brand that you'd like. But again, if we don't have that, it's something I can help with.
Yeah, I think with our new logo, we're updating all those materials. So that's a great idea. We have Joyce available for a question.
Hello, thank you very much for this platform. I still have issues, we all do. But as my son would teach me, while he was homeless and on the streets, and while he spoke up to media, was nothing about us without us. And so I'm trying to learn more about him. He died last October. He was killed because of the lack of political will to get clean drugs out there, safe drugs out there. And right now I'm still stuck with realizing I can only talk of his life and his journey. He used methamphetamines, and he used it to control his ADHD. And he was 45. He had lived a whole life out learning. But I find I can't very well be an advocate. I don't know enough when we talk about people who use opiates or people who have addictions or people who are trying to go into recovery, because I can just deal with his life, and that wasn't him. But I did find that trying to find out about him, so much of the media that I would read even or see on TV headlines or even in shows, so much of it didn't hit right with me of how they were talking, especially about meth users, people using methamphetamines and other stimulants. And so much of the talk was scare talk. And I could only go back to when I was 17 and drugs I would use, and that the effects of them were nothing like I was hearing in the media. So I went to reading all of the books that you recommend and writing down sound bites from them and writing down information, new education for me. And I did find that a lot of good information was in those books, and the ones who spoke from their own personal knowledge on drug use and being in the realm of writing papers and reading papers, I found a lot of help for myself in reading Dr. Carl Hart's book, The Drug Use for Grown-Ups. So I'm just out there still trying to find out information about my son's journey. so that I can keep talking, about him, with him in my mind, and his knowledge I'm getting from what his experience was, because I think there's other people who need that slant too, that not everybody out there is doing, of course, opiates, and not everybody is out there addicted, and not everybody is out there needing or looking for recovery. And that's just, I don't think I can really speak up generally then, because I'm still focused on my son's journey.
Yeah. Well, that's the journey that you know. I mean, that's the journey you're looking for, and that's the story you can tell. And I applaud your research, because you'll broaden your information, and hopefully you'll find out more about your son's story. Thank you so much, Joyce.
Thank you.
And just Jenny, one thing to add to that is that I think, doing interviews and doing media, I know that was the focus of this discussion, but there's even, in your own networks that, something I didn't talk about that was on one of the slides is what they call word of mouth, and how we're in an era now of digital information sharing, where before we could reach people in our community and in our network, but now there's the ability for us to reach people across the country, across the province, across the world, and sharing your information in any way that you feel comfortable sharing it, and going on that journey for discovery and finding, the information that you're looking for. No journey's the same. And I just know that any information you want to share, however you want to share it, that's the path, and that's okay. And I think I've learned a lot about this too. Sometimes I don't have the information that I get asked about. And so again, it comes back, I think, to speak to what you're comfortable speaking to. If there's something that you don't feel comfortable speaking to, redirect that to other people. And I do applaud everyone for the courage that you've taken thus far, for those that have done media and for those that are sharing the information in their networks. It's okay to share what works for you, and it's okay not to share if you don't feel comfortable doing media. So.
Thank you. Andy, I am conscious of your time, so you tell us where you're at with that. We have, okay, great. We've got 2 more questions with, I did see Matthew, but it looks like his hand is, Matthew, there you are. Can you unmute?
Yeah, sorry, I thought we were out of time.
Oh, yeah.
My question, I did an interview last month that comes out this week. Hopefully it went well. But my question is, how do we follow up and to try and make it not just a one-off, or to expand it to other newspapers or media sites? It's in a local paper. One
That's
of your
a great
points
question.
about sharing. Yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking the question, because I think one of the things that we can use a story once it's published for is to help share that and generate interest from other outlets. So to your first question, how do you create another interview? Well, I think thanking that reporter, sharing the information in your social network, sharing it with the people that you can. I think that's step one. Other media may pick up on that. Step 2, I think, is thanking the reporter and following up with them after the story comes out. And it happens so infrequently now, and you can ask reporters about this that you talk to. They very rarely hear the thank you. They'll hear the complaint about how the story didn't represent somebody often, but they very rarely get the thank you. And so I think, if there is a need to correct, once that information's corrected, then you share the story. But in terms of getting it to other outlets, if you're comfortable reaching out, so you have a story appear, what community are you from, Matthew?
North Vancouver.
So you're in North Vancouver, so the story comes out in North Vancouver publication. Once it's out, you can reach out to other outlets and say, I had a story published in, name the outlet, and share a copy with it. If you ever need a suggestion for a reporter, again, we're happy to help with that. We're starting to build a media list. But I think it's that amplification of the story, sharing it in your networks and helping that message to spread. But it's a good question, because the thank you and the share will often create more credibility for you with that reporter, and they're likely to come back to you to share your story down the road.
Okay. Thanks very much. And thank you everyone for the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. And we have a question from Lorna. Hi, Lorna. Great to see you.
Hi, Jennifer. Yeah, mine's more of a comment. I guess I just wanted to welcome the men in this session. I think from my point of view, it's the first time I've seen so many men in a workshop. So I'm really encouraged that, that you're here, and hope that you do get opportunities to speak to the media. And certainly there's been some chat. It came up actually, I did a presentation to our city council here in Edmonton, and the councillor I was working with, he asked, well, you know, I'm not sure how I feel being a speaker on behalf of Mum Stop the Harm because I'm a man. So I think this is an interesting point that can be pursued as you go further with your media strategy. And I just thought it was an interesting observation because he's stepping down from city council, wants to get more involved with Mum Stop the Harm, but was curious about the names. So just something to think about as you go forward. And as a person who's done a lot of media, literally from the day our son died, it never really gets easier, but it's always gratifying.
Lorna, thanks for that comment. And can I just build on what you've said? Because I think there's a piece there about media fatigue. And I think I did see a comment. Yeah, it's from Kim. Media can be exhausting when you share your story, especially if it's about a loved one. That can be hard. And that's okay. It's okay if it's hard. You know, you can do one interview, you can do 5 interviews. It's going to impact different people in different ways. And I think it's okay that, you know, if you need some time off doing media after you do it, take that time. Take the time that you need to self-care. And you know, if you ever want feedback on an interview or media that you've done, you know, that's okay too. If you don't feel, you know, we'd be happy to help provide that. If you don't want to do a live interview, it's okay to ask for questions in writing and to do it in writing. That's another way you can do that. That way you're controlling when you do it and the time that you invest in it. So I just wanted to reflect on that and share that because I think that's important for everyone.
Great. Andy, we have Janet who has a question.
Hi, thank you for that, Jennifer. I didn't seem to have a hand up icon on my screen anywhere for some reason. I'm just wondering, do we do, I should say Mum Stop the Harm? I'm a very new member. I have a son in active addiction, fentanyl, and he's in very deep. So I live in fear. But one of the experiences we had was him in the hospital for MRSA infection, and he was treated horribly the whole time he was in there. I have to say, I give them credit that they allowed him to exit the building and use and come back in for his antibiotics. However, the nurses were going through his stuff and taking his drugs and getting rid of them. So that left us in a position of having to buy because his money was gone. And it was just a brutal, the whole thing was a brutal. I felt like I wanted to sit in his room every day and explain to them who he really was. So I'm wondering, do we have any education that way? Is there anything going, like, are the nurses being trained, are the doctors being trained in compassionate care at all?
Yeah, I can answer that a little bit. I don't know all of it, but more and more nurses, nurse practitioners, and medical health professionals, and hopefully lots of family doctors, they have the opportunity, they have the permission, there are sites, and like BCCSU, BC Center on Substance Use, has a fellowship program, and more are, but not enough. So yes, you know, we're working to reduce stigma in the ERs. I mean, it's a critical piece, and also in the doctor's office. So yeah, just keep watching for opportunities. And if you wanted to speak on that very thing, just what Andy is saying, you know, find an opportunity that you're comfortable with, approach them. Andy has all the info on that. I'm not going to step into that area, but tell your story, you know. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I know I've heard your story, and I'm so sorry that this is happening, but hang in there.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, just add to Leslie's comment, Janet, that I'm on a working group, a provincial working group here in BC that includes health authorities. And one of the things that internal communicators are doing with their HR departments right now, because of great advocacy from this group, they are doing anti-stigma and language sessions with their staff to make sure that that's the starting point to having a bigger discussion for better understanding people who use drugs. And I think that that is such an important step, because we've heard examples in different communities where that stigmatizing language is used and stigmatizing behavior, and it, it doesn't help. And so, on that working group, it's all with communicators and marketing people. I'd be more than happy if there are any resources to share them with that group. So feel free to reach out directly if that helps at all.
I really appreciate that. I know that I guess the end result was, because he was treated so badly, he left, and then they called us and said, find him, because this infection will kill him if the overdose doesn't. So it was a brutal time, and I just thought, and then as it went on, as I say, and things got taken from his room and they were going through his stuff and that, I just thought, is there any training here? Is that the problem? So I'm happy for your answers. Thank you.
Great. And Andy, we don't have any more hands up.
I have one more little hint to give everyone, because this has happened to me. Maybe it won't happen to you. You're more organized when you're being interviewed. When I'm asked a question and I begin to answer, sometimes I kind of go in a different direction and then realize, this has happened to me several times, and that I don't even remember what the question was. So then I say, does that answer your question? I just wanted to give that one hint, because when someone, it wasn't you, Andy, I think it was our friend Kevin Hall that said that, I was so grateful just to have that little phrase, did that answer your question, instead of, oh, sorry, what was the question? That's all.
It's a great tool to have in the toolkit. I have a list of my cheat sheet. That's one of my 3, did that answer your question? Because sometimes, like you said, you can get on a tangent, or reporters are famous, particularly in live interviews, for asking what they call a double-barreled question. So sometimes it'll be a yes or no question at the front end, and then an open-ended question at the back end. And you could pick or choose which one you choose to answer. But then you want to make sure that you're not dismissing the first part of that question. So it can be very complicated. An example is, are we out of this crisis? What more must be done? And that's a good example of a double-barreled question that we'll get often. And you could choose to answer both of those or none of them and go back to your key messaging. But at the end of the day, doing your best is all we can ask. And I just give everyone props in advance for anything you're about to do and anything that you've done in the past. Grateful. We're all in this together. So thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. Jenny, did you want to close, or we didn't really practice this part?
We didn't have a close, but I'm sure Leslie, we just so appreciate your presentation today, Andy, and your willingness to share these documents are so helpful for those of us that are still learning to navigate media. And I know in BC, it's a big week for us coming up, so it's very timely.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And again, if you have questions, Andy's available. This is recorded, and I think we know how to access it. Will we know how to access it, Jenny?
Yes, it'll be posted on our YouTube channel.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Soldier on, etc. And we're so grateful for all of you to be here, and even the ones who aren't here, we're grateful for all our members. Bye.